There's hope of improved relations between the world's two economic superpowers following talks between U.S. President Joe Biden and China's President Xi Jinping. At a summit of Asia-Pacific nations held in California, both leaders said that they would like to see better ties. The meeting was carefully choreographed and scripted, except for the comment from a very blunt Biden.
Ready.
The world's two most powerful men meeting face to face for the first time in over a year. Despite the genteel background, this was a high-stakes summit aimed at improving difficult relations between the US and China.
I value our conversation because I think it's paramount that you and I understand each other clearly, leader to leader, with no misconceptions or miscommunication. We have to ensure that competition does not veer into conflict.
Planet Earth is big enough for our two countries to succeed, and one country's success is an opportunity for the other.
After 4 hours of talks, the two are said to have taken positive steps forward.
President Biden, how are talks going?
Including a decision to restart military communications.
We're reassuming military-to-military contacts, direct contacts. As a lot of you press know who follow this, that's been cut off, and it's been very worrisome. That's how accidents happen, misunderstandings. So we're back to direct, open, clear, direct communications on a direct basis.
They also discussed controversial subjects like Taiwan. But it was Biden's response to a question about whether he would still refer to Xi as a dictator that raised eyebrows.
Well, look, he is. I mean, he's a dictator in the sense that he is the guy who runs a country that is a communist country that's based on a form of government totally different than ours. Anyway,
that didn't land well with Beijing. But at a dinner after their talks, President Xi was keen to focus on the two superpowers working together.
China is willing to be a partner and friend with the United States. Our fundamental principles in handling Chinese-US relations are mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation.
The fact that Xi and Biden met at all is being hailed a success. Whether relations between China and the US actually improve will be down to them.
All right, for more now, I'm joined by Alan Carlson. He's an associate professor in government at Cornell University. Mr. Carlson, it's good to have you with us. The U.S. president, Mr. Biden, he went into this meeting to mend strained ties with China. How far did he get?
He went a ways. I think both sides moved in that direction. But the fact of the matter is there are fundamental underlying differences between the two countries. And so it's not just that he used the term dictator, something you said before, but the domestic responses here to the overtures he's made. And if you look at the Chinese media, too, there's been a little bit of pushback to the more peaceful language which Xi used while he was in the United States.
Well, let me just pick up on what he did say. He did, said he is a dictator. And I mean, that is the truth. He's certainly not a democratically elected leader, but that may not have been the most diplomatic thing to say. Do you think that that damaged any progress that was made earlier in those face-to-face meetings?
I don't think so. I mean, we know that President Biden is not a wordsmith. And so sometimes his choice of words is a little bit off. That happens to all of us all the time. And the definition of a dictator is also something which people in my profession debate all the time. It's not like we agree. I think the main thing is that Xi is a different type of leader than his predecessors, immediate predecessors in China. But he's also nowhere near the kind of prototypical dictators of the past, people like Mao or Stalin. And so I think Biden's trying to point that out and, maybe got his lines flubbed a little bit, but that happens to all of us all the time. And I think it's going to cause a problem with China.
And so they did agree to reestablish direct communications on a military level. What about tensions over Taiwan? Did you see any progress made over that island?
No, there's very little room for progress. I think at best the two sides can agree to disagree. Fundamentally, they see the status of Taiwan differently. What does happen is I think the temperature has been dialed down a bit, but there's always things moving forward in Congress in terms of supporting Taiwan. And there are always measures which China is taking to demonstrate its resolve to bring what they see as their territory back under their governance. And so this is a perennial issue. It's been there when Nixon met Mao. It'll be there whoever comes next. It's not going away.
The U.S. says it doesn't want to decouple its economy from China, but it does want to de-risk the relationship. Considering that and the fact that China is not boasting economic growth that it was used to for several decades, was China going into these talks in a weaker position?
I think it's more the leadership of both countries have maybe come to the realization that we need each other, even if we don't like each other that well. I think it's twofold. One is the security situation around the globe right now is incredibly precarious, and not wanting to throw another log on that fire by escalating conflict between our two sides. And the global economy is also fragile, and that's not going to benefit anyone. And so I think the image, the optics of cooperation are important in trying to reassure the global population and reassure markets that things are okay.
Professor Alan Carlson joining us tonight from Cornell University. Professor, we appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Kelly Grio is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Among other things, her work looks at U.S. security policy in the Indo-Pacific region. Ms. Grio, it's good to have you with us. First things first, I just want to get your reaction to what is getting a lot of attention today, and that is President Biden referring to Xi Jinping after their talks as a dictator.
Yes, well, first, thank you for having me. Unfortunately, there has been a lot of coverage today around those comments from President Biden. I think what is going to be really interesting is to see the Chinese response to it. In particular, in the past, they've responded very strongly to these kinds of statements. And I think it would be, of course, really unfortunate if some of the progress that they made during the discussions yesterday, if it got undermined by sort of a diplomatic blowback from those remarks.
Yeah, there are these persistent war worries, reestablishing military-to-military communication between these two countries. How important a step is that to avoiding an accidental conflict, accidental war?
I think it's critical, frankly. I think both sides have become increasingly very concerned about the possibility of ending in some kind of accidental escalation, that there would be some kind of incident either in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea where there's just an accident, that aircraft or ships get too close together and then it very quickly spirals out of control. There was an incident with a B-52 that was doing a freedom navigation mission and that a fighter aircraft got within 10 feet of it. That's very dangerous. And so, even during the course of the Ukraine war, the United States has maintained close contacts, mill-to-mill contacts with the Russians to try to prevent those kinds of incidents. And so having that with the Chinese is really important to try to mitigate some of these considerable risks.
Yeah, I mean, the risks are considerable, as you say. I mean, the tension around Taiwan remains. And despite all the rhetoric about economic ties, would you say that the U.S. and China really are preparing for a war against each other one day?
Well, I think I don't see evidence that either country actually really wants a war. I think that's important to distinguish from preparing for the possibility. I think we see signs that neither is particularly interested in a war or would like to avoid it. But these are both, frankly, countries that are preparing for that possibility. Which is what countries tend to do. And one of the real dangers here is that in making these preparations out of a national security imperative, that we don't end up sort of in a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I think, when you look at the summit and what was achieved, I think from the Chinese perspective, one of the things was achieved is Biden reaffirming the one China policy. That was clearly something that was important for the Chinese.
I want us to talk now for a moment about the economics of this relationship. Last year, you wrote an article in The Diplomat, and in that you write, the Biden administration strategy for addressing the China challenge is lacking. There is no strategy, at least no credible strategy, without robust economic statecraft. For our viewers, tell us, what is a robust economic statecraft? What does it look like?
Yes. So one of the things that is really tragic is that in the last 5-7 years, the United States has really stepped back from free trade policy. But the world is moving on without the United States. So there's now two major regional free trade agreements in the Indo-Pacific, and the United States is not a party to either of them. And in place of the United States, China is assuming a greater and greater role in the economic sphere and in its relationship with countries. And the United States is really just on the sidelines. And then in this way, we're losing a lot of leverage and influence in the region. And, I was really very disappointed and sad to see that the Biden administration had announced something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was to try to be, frankly, a poor substitute for these other regional free trade agreements. But even now, that is reportedly on hold.
So in your opinion, the United States is not doing enough to make itself more attractive than China is to other Southeastern economies when it comes to trade relations?
Yes, I think what you're seeing is that both sides are really leaning into what they see as their comparative advantage. China sees its comparative advantage as that economic relationship, and the United States sees its comparative advantage as security and defense.
I know that you have also written that Americans will have to possibly make sacrifices to meet the Chinese challenge one day, but you say sacrificing free trade with Asia is not one of them. Now, does that mean in the future you'll still be able to go to Walmart, you'll still be able to get things cheap, but they won't have made in China on them anymore, maybe made in Vietnam?
Perhaps. I think one of the things I was trying to say with that is there's a perception here that the United States has not benefited from free trade. We have benefited enormously from free trade. And I think it's unfortunate that there has been some of that belief within the United States domestic population. And so actually free trade supports U.S. interests. It supports the interests of the average worker. And whether, as you say, that in the future goods are going to be made with China or they're going to be made with many other nations in the Indo-Pacific, that's actually all a benefit to the U.S. economy.
I'd like to get your take on what we saw happening at this summit. When the sun set, it was time for dinner. A lot of Silicon Valley CEOs had dinner with Xi Jinping. And I'm wondering who is courting whom these days when these two elements come together?
That's a great question. In some respects, I think they probably wonder themselves. I think, right now, China is in an economic downturn. It's struggling, recovering, coming out of COVID. It has very high economic unemployment rates among its younger population. And so, I would normally say perhaps it's even more so the CEOs courting China. But frankly, I think a big reason we had this sort of diplomatic exchange is because Chinese government is very concerned about their economic situation. Yeah. And that's why you're seeing this outreach.
Well, at a price tag, I think it was, $40,000 a plate for that dinner. We know that the big tech CEOs, we know who's got the money there. Kelly Grio, good talking with you. We appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for having me.